Hello, everyone. It is a great pleasure to welcome you all to this spring meeting flagship event, Unlocking Financing for Climate Action. Now, as leaders from government, international organizations, civil society, businesses, philanthropy, all gather here in Washington during these spring meetings, climate change is at the center of the global conversation, and the timing couldn't be more important. Now, bringing some of the climate skeptics on board, of course, and making sure that all governments deliver on the promises they made in Paris in December of 2015 is going to be one of the key challenges. Bringing other stakeholders on board as well will be crucial. As we all know, the Paris Agreement produced an ambitious plan. Maintaining the momentum now and mobilizing the resources, of course, is more vital than ever. We have a weighty panel, as you can see, in very limited time. For some reason, the organizers insisted that I introduce our panelists, and frankly, I think the only one who needs an introduction is me. I'm Ghida Fakhry, a journalist, used to interrupting panelists sometimes, even presidents, or those who should have been president. I would let everyone know. But let me welcome you nonetheless and introduce you all very briefly. Yong Kim, of course, to my left, President of the World Bank, our host. Al Gore, Chairman of the Climate Reality Project, former Vice President of the United States. Christiana Figueres, Mission 2020 convener and World Bank Group climate leader. Jeff Skoll, founder and chairman of Skoll Foundation, also the first president of eBay. Magdalena Andersson, Minister of Finance of Sweden. And last but not least, Eric Solheim, executive director of UNEP, the United Nations Environment Programme. Now, as you can see, some of the key players across all sectors are gathered here on stage, and they are all old friends of one another. I think you've been working together on this and other global issues for very many years. Over the next hour, we'll be discussing the urgency for climate action, the ways in which all different actors are responding, how much more needs to be done to meet the Paris goals, and of course, to keep everyone on board. And maybe there is some hope here, I should say, some good news. Now that we know that NATO is no longer obsolete, maybe soon we'll be hearing that climate change is no longer a Chinese hoax. So maybe some positive optimistic note here to open our conversation on, as well as inviting everyone who's watching this discussion online. The event is being webcast live in 4 of the official languages, English, Arabic, French, and Spanish, at worldbank.org. You can also follow live tweets and live blogs at WBG_climate on Twitter using the hashtag #InvestForClimate. So now that all of this is out of the way, let's get straight to business. Delivering on the Paris Agreement will have to take accelerated action at all levels, as we've been saying. How do we mobilize private and public investment to meet the targets of the Paris Agreement and keep the momentum in place? The World Bank is the largest funder of climate-related investments. Let me first turn to our host, the President of the World Bank Group, Yong Kim. Dr. Kim, a lot of people know, some maybe don't. You are a physician and anthropologist by training. The first World Bank president, I believe, not from the worlds of politics or finance, and this in a way maybe explains why you have steered the World Bank in such a radically different direction in dealing with short-term emergencies, dealing with crises that the World Bank was never involved in. And frankly, I think 2-3 decades ago, it's fair to say the World Bank did not have a very good name in the global south. You yourself, 20 years ago, had called for this institution to be torn down. I mean, clearly that wasn't used against you. It wasn't held against you when you were nominated. But you say that there's multiple pandemics and emergencies the world has to deal with. Famine, refugees, so on, and climate. But you said climate is a test. You've sounded the alarm bell. We're running out of time. Before we actually mobilize the resources, do we have to make sure that there's enough engagement, though, that the private sector, that civil society, that everyone is engaged? Otherwise, will we see the trillions that we need? And we're not talking about billions anymore. We're talking about trillions.
Well, first of all, can you hear? Yeah. First of all, let me just thank the panelists for being here. And the story that you gave, Ghida, about how we move toward climate and some of the other global public goods issues, it's not. Let me just be very honest about it. I mean, I didn't know anywhere near enough about climate change as I should have, as simply an informed person. But Vice President Gore came to see me like in the first month or two of my presidency, and he sat and took out his laptop and showed me graph after graph after graph. And it was great. I come from the medical world, and that's what we do. We use slides and we explain things to people. And he did it in a way that was so compelling that he literally converted me on the spot. And I just want to thank him because he's done that for lots of people in the world. I did see the movie, but seeing the movie across the table from you is something else. And the data had changed. The data had changed dramatically from when he made the movie. So that and Rachel Kite, who now runs Sustainable Energy for all had this, and I started to realize this is one of the great issues of our time. But let me say something else, Ghida. This is not about arguing with people. We're not here to argue with people. What we're here to do is to take all the forces that are already unleashed. And I really believe that it's like a supersaturated solution. It just needs a crystal to bring it together much more effectively. And Christiana is just an absolute hero from having gotten us across the line in Paris. Jeff has been working on this forever. You may not know, Jeff was one of the people that really were behind the Inconvenient Truth movie, and he's been doing this forever. Magdalena and Eric. Magdalena has been such a champion for climate change, and Eric, coming from OECD DAC, it's great to have you back in the environment world. So this is an amazing panel, right? And just bringing this group of people together, I think, is a step in making sure that crystal drops and we bring things together. So here's what I see. What I see is that they're quite apart from concern for climate change. There's huge amounts of capital sitting on the sideline, and I keep repeating these numbers because they're important. $8.5 trillion in negative interest rate bonds, $24.5 trillion in extremely low-yielding government-type bonds, and an additional $8 trillion sitting in cash, literally in cash, waiting for good investment. So quite apart from what you think about climate change, there are opportunities for investments that will give you higher yield than any of those investments, in which over 40 trillion is sitting right now. So how do you bring that together? And I think what happened was that with Christiana's leadership, there was tremendous discussion about how to finance climate change prior to Paris. But then I think we've had an extended hangover from the celebration party after Paris, and we didn't get to the nitty-gritty of how we're going to finance everything. So there are many possibilities. There's the Green Climate Fund. There's our own climate investment funds. There's individual. There are philanthropists. There are individual wealthy people who want to contribute. We want to bring them all together and have the discussion every day about every person's contribution can lead to the kinds of policy changes, can get the capital going, can provide guarantees. All together, we have everything we need to just accelerate on the climate agenda.
But as you say, Dr. Kim, I mean, yes, this needs a collective approach, and there are a few very important mechanisms that are already in place. Looking at what the World Bank can do, though, I mean, I know that you've launched an insurance instrument that releases emergency funds to deal with epidemics before they reach a certain level, before they get to the level of pandemics. Are we at that stage yet where climate change might elicit this type of response, where it reaches emergency levels and where you might need to come in and put together a climate change emergency fund of some sort?
Well, in many ways, we're already doing that because we put up 1.6 billion for the famine, and everywhere you go in Africa, they'll tell you that it's because of the increasingly unpredictable cycles of drought, flooding. And so, yes, conflict is behind many of these famines, but there's no question that the unpredictability of the climate is a driving force. So I feel like we're already responding to the emergencies that are coming out of climate change. I mean, I think though that we're hearing new kinds of language. And one example, I think the most powerful force at the end of the day will be in some form of a price on carbon, right? And so we have to change the language so that we can convince countries that if you don't have a price on carbon, you're going to be behind, because the incentives for innovation in the fastest growing fields of the future won't be there in your country, and countries like Sweden will overtake us because they have had very rapid growth and a robust tax on carbon. So we've got to change the story away from an argument to really illustrating all the great things that could happen if we work together effectively, like with the people on this panel.
Thank you very much, President Kim. And as you mentioned, carbon pricing is one of the policy instruments that can be used. We'll be talking to the Swedish Minister of Finance about this perhaps in a few moments. But turning to you now, Mr. Gore, you've been traveling the world, of course, everyone knows, for many years, crisscrossing this country, but the world as well, talking to people from government, civil society, businesses, philanthropists, trying to raise the alarm bell, trying to get everyone to understand the seriousness of the climate crisis. The Nobel Peace Prize Committee, in fact, 10 years ago, gave you the prize for informing the world about the dangers posed by climate change. I was struck listening to a speech you gave about a year ago where you sounded extremely upbeat and positive. I perhaps won't ask you how you're feeling today, knowing that this is webcast and we're only a tweet away. But let me just say, looking first at this whole thing, leaving the US aside for a minute, just looking at this from a more global perspective, do you sense, speaking to all the people you have been talking with over the last few years, that there's a new level of consciousness, even in countries which have not been directly affected yet by climate change? Do you sense that, or are we still at the level of business as usual?
Well, thank you, Ghida. And before I respond to your question, I want to express my heartfelt gratitude and admiration for President Jim Kim for making the climate crisis and its solutions a top priority, for convening this meeting, and for doing so much more. During the Paris negotiations that Christiana led so ably, Jim was in the background, in the foreground some of the time, but in the background very active as well, lining up possibilities to help get nations across the line, and I'm really a huge fan, Jim. Thank you. I am optimistic. And anyone who deals with the issue of the climate crisis for very long has an internal dialogue between the separate poles of hope and despair. To some extent, hope is an act of will, but for me, I have seen the growing evidence that, yes, there is a new awareness, both an awareness of the existential threat we face and a growing awareness that we actually do have the tools that we need available now. And if we choose to use these tools wisely, and if we can figure out with Jim's help and the help of all the people here and meetings here later today, how to really mobilize more finance, then there's no doubt in my mind that we will solve the climate crisis. It is already an emergency. Sometimes emergencies are not clearly visible to all, but just yesterday, the governor of the state of Louisiana in the U.S. declared a state of emergency because of climate eroding the shoreline of Louisiana. 2 days ago, the insurance trade journals reported how the entire insurance and financing infrastructure for coastal properties on the east coast of the United States was in danger of collapsing. Every night now on the television news is like a nature hike through the book of Revelation. We have these extraordinary events, and we still describe them in terms of statistics from an earlier era as a once-in-a-1,000-year event and a once-in-500-year event. Last year, Houston, Texas, the center of the global petroleum industry, had two 1-in-a-500-year floods and one 1-in-a-1,000-year downpour in a 12-month period. Now, on the solution side,
But before we get to the
Yes.
solution side, I wonder to what extent the US needs to be part of the solution. I mean, as we know, the US is the second largest emitter of carbon in the world after China. There is a consciousness, I believe, in this country as well, looking at statistics, some 70 to 80% of Americans support climate change regulation. But the government may be going in a different direction. And let's be honest about it, I don't think Paris would have happened if the US hadn't been on board and signed onto it. I mean, Copenhagen, Christiana Figueres can tell us as well, failed because China and the US did not agree. But to what extent can the Paris Agreement and what we're talking about here today have any kind of credibility if a critical player like the US reneges?
Well, I think there is an excellent chance, far better than 50-50, that the United States will decide to stay in the Paris Agreement. I don't know that for certain, but I feel very strongly that will be the case. And the U.S. is sometimes defined as what the executive branch of the federal government does. And of course, what the executive branch of the federal government does is extremely important. But we have state governments, we have city governments, we have businesses and industries. And last year, the construction of new electricity generating capacity in the U.S. came more than 70% from solar and wind. The balance was from gas. We need to start phasing gas out as well as soon as we can, but virtually none from coal. There are twice as many jobs in car washes as there are in the coal industry taken as a whole. And they're valuable jobs that should be honored, and the people working them should be cared for and dealt with in a very constructive way. But solar jobs in the U.S. are now growing 17 times faster than job growth in the economy generally. The single fastest growing job, expected to remain that for the next 10 years, is wind turbine technician. So we are seeing a dramatic shift in the U.S. as in the global economy generally. In fact, I believe it's now clear that we are in this world in the early stages of a sustainability revolution that has the scale and magnitude of the Industrial Revolution, but the speed of the digital revolution. Businesses and industries worldwide are retooling in order to be competitive. They're using the new digital tools, including the Internet of Things, and they're finding ways to boost productivity and profits even as they sharply reduce emissions. And we've gone for 3 years in a row now with no increase in emissions, and it's a sign that we're at an inflection point.
And we'll see where we go from there.
Yeah, and I think that there is every reason to expect, just one final point. I know you need to move on, but the interaction, I agree that we need to put a price on carbon, either directly or indirectly, or both, as Sweden has done with a tax and cap and trade. And companies are already putting an internal price on carbon. But governments, and the U.S. is not the worst in this regard, but the U.S. and governments around the world should finally eliminate the subsidies for the dirty fuels, for the fossil fuels. They're calculated to be 40 times larger than the meager support for renewable energy. And by the way, on the preparation document for the G20 meeting, the U.S. government kept into that document a joint call for the elimination of those subsidies. One final point.
Right.
One final point.
But you did read my mind on fossil fuels, because I think there's still huge investment in fossil fuels.
Well, there are, but in the last 7 years, the market capitalization of the coal industry has fallen 96%. And the International Energy Agency has told us, along with the IPCC, that no more than 1/3 of the already proven oil and gas reserves can ever be burned. So we have $22 trillion of subprime carbon assets, and just like the subprime mortgages, their value is based on an illusion that is going to dissipate, and once it starts to dissipate, it'll dissipate quickly. I don't know when, but certainly within the investment horizons of pension funds and long-term investors, and we're already seeing a massive shift globally. Since 2010, the investments into renewables have far outpaced investments into fossil, and the gap grows each year. But I want to make one final point on the global economy. I'm sorry.
I'm doing a very lousy job of interrupting.
Well, I just want to make this final point. On the global economy, you know, here we are with relatively low growth, and we have a weakness in secular demand. We can't use, if we get a business cycle recession, we can't use the interest rate tool, as we've always done in the past, because it's at virtual zero now. So we should feel a sense of urgency about boosting secular demand. What if we had a global project that would put tens of millions of people and more back to work, building things of value that would help us in this crisis? Well, we have such a project. Not only the infrastructure for renewable energy, but retrofitting buildings and converting to sustainable agriculture and forestry. What the world needs is the vision to see that the solution to our global economic malaise is precisely the solution to the climate crisis.
Okay. Thank you very much, Mr. Gore. And you do make very important points. The annual investment in fossil fuels estimated at 1.6 trillion, despite, as you say, the investment that's being made in renewable energy. But just moving, and perhaps coming back to this a little later, moving on to Christiana Figueres. We've said, and everyone knows, you've been playing an instrumental role in the negotiations, certainly those that have led to COP21, that is the Paris Agreement. Getting 194, 195 countries to sign on to this in and of itself was a feat. But can we just rest on our laurels? I mean, I presume there's much more work to be done. What do you see as the key challenge? The US being in or out? How detrimental is this? Can you manage without big countries? Is it all about the financing at the end of the day, the trillions of dollars that you need?
It is a lot about the financing, and no, we can certainly not rest on our laurels. My colleague here, Tom Karnak, knows that we all went to sleep in Paris at some horrible hour, and 5 hours later I called him and I said, Tom, right, it's time to get back to work. So, you know, that is only proof of the urgency that we all know that we have to rise to. And it really is about the financing, because I think we all know what the sectors are that need transformation. I would certainly agree with Vice President Gore about the huge potential that we have to really put the economy back on a solid path that will take us many decades forward. But I'm actually, you know, a born optimist, a stubborn optimist, as I call myself, and I continue to see that we are bringing more and more solutions. Today, my optimism comes from an announcement that was just made an hour and a half ago, not very far from here. IFC and Amundi, that is the largest European asset manager, have just announced that they are putting together a green bond fund to the tune of $2 trillion to buy green bonds in emerging markets. Why is that exciting? Well, that's exciting.
It was actually $2 billion. Sorry, it was $2 billion.
Are you sure?
Yeah.
It did sound.
Are you totally sure?
Yes, I'm totally sure. Yeah, $2 billion. Right.
Still good.
Okay, it's still good.
So because I'm the one who has to pay for
I saw a report
them,
on trillion.
Right? It wasn't.
You see what the press does.
The bottom line is we need the trillions.
No, but the thing is, it's $2 billion. But the great thing about it is it's going to invest in green bonds that are floated by developing countries. This is the first time.
So let me just go into that, because what is very exciting is that most of the green bonds right now, and correct me if I'm again wrong, President Kim, are actually being emitted by financial institutions or corporations in the global north. And this is very exciting because this is focused exclusively on emerging markets. The IFC will actually give support to those banks and financial institutions that want to emit those green bonds so that they can actually bring that instrument to market at green bond standards. And the IFC is actually going to take off some of the risk by taking the first loss off it and introducing a first loss mechanism there. So, very, very exciting to get the financial institutions in the countries that really matter, because it is the global south that really matters.
Precisely, and I think you bring out that divide between North and South. And I think being the only one on the panel representing the global South, you are from Costa Rica, many of us know. How do countries, the developing countries who feel they've really suffered from the huge carbon footprint of the rich world, how are they coping with the idea of the funds trickling along at the billion-dollar rate, not the trillion-dollar rate, a bit slowly? Is there a sense that more needs to be done?
No, of course. And
who do they look to?
Well, and countries, honestly, they need a lot of support, both for adaptation as well as for mitigation, for bringing down emissions. And it's easier to mobilize funds for mitigation than it is for adaptation, but they need it for both. But I think in the spirit of what President Kim has said, we need to use all sources of financing, right? So the national budgets also need to become much smarter about how they use their own funding. But we also need to mobilize all of that idle capital that is sitting there gaining negative interest. And so something like a green bond fund really begins to build that bridge between that idle, non-performing capital and the investments that need to be made, in particular in developing countries.
And many people will say that we could never get to the Paris Agreement goals without the private sector. Big philanthropy probably as well, and I'm looking at you, Jeff Skoll, wearing both hats. You're one of the largest single private investors in clean energy, also a leading philanthropist and social entrepreneur. You've also tapped into the power of the media, producing, as we said earlier, that movie, The Inconvenient Truth. And just for some of the younger audience, I think, following us on our webcast, just to let you know that this has nothing to do, the title of the movie at least, with the current realities perhaps here and elsewhere. There is a sequel, I hear, which is great. I think we'll all be looking forward to that, the Inconvenient sequel. But tell us a little bit, Jeff Skoll, about your level of optimism. Christiana Figueres also once said that we have gone from the impossible to the unstoppable. How optimistic are you, and where do you see a role for major companies using their significant clout, and for big donors as well?
First, thank you very much for the introduction, and I will answer this question from the point of view of a philanthropist, entrepreneur, and a storyteller. And I too will start, as Dr. Kim did, by thanking Al for shaking my world. In 2005, I had just come back from a big environmental conference in Jordan, and there were a number of tracks, one of which was climate change, and the finding of these Nobel scientists at that time was, well, climate change will be a big deal in 30 to 40 years, but we don't have to worry about it so much now. I flew back to LA, where I met Al doing his slideshow presentation, as he had been doing on climate change, to rooms like this, 100, 200 people at a time. And he rocked my world. I said, oh my God, this is so urgent, we have to get on this now. And people don't feel that urgency. And Al, if you do these presentations 100 people at a time, it's going to take quite a while to reach a critical mass. Why don't we make a movie? And so Al thought that was not the best idea. Al thought it was a terrible idea. My people thought it was a terrible idea. Nonetheless, we went ahead and did it. And 7 months later, we debuted An Inconvenient Truth, which went on to bring the issue of climate change to the world's attention and into corners of the world that we could never have imagined. So not just making films, but also investing in the technologies to address climate change and to address clean energy. My group, so I do investing and philanthropy and various other means, all meant to try to solve the biggest problems in the world. A couple of years back, Al and I were talking about sort of the state of the world, where we were, and is it time to make a sequel to the movie? And we agreed that the 10-year anniversary of An Inconvenient Truth was a good time. But what was the story? And the real story was the emergence of inexpensive, clean, renewable, reliable energy that was popping up around the world at rates that nobody could have possibly predicted. 10 years ago, it used to cost $4 for an installed watt of solar, and that price has dropped down to 30-odd cents. It'll be pennies 5 years from now. It's really followed that Moore's Law kind of progression. Batteries have improved bit by bit, year over year. Elon Musk is a great friend of mine and Al's, and many of you here. He's been building a Ghida Fakhry in Nevada to create the world's greatest manufacturer of lithium-ion batteries, mostly to meet demand for electric cars, for Teslas, which are taking off. But that's just part of the equation. The other night, I was honored to host Canada's new environment and climate change minister, and we brought around us in Silicon Valley a lot of the folks that are working on the next gen of technology. We are within a year and a half of the next generation of batteries, which will be a fraction of the cost, with far more storage, with a great deal of opportunity. And just on a cost per cost level, we are either at price parity or better than the cheapest of the fossil fuels now, and those numbers are only coming down.
But if that is the case, why aren't more major companies seeing the benefit, the economic sense behind investing in renewable energy? I mean, where's the money? We don't see much investment beyond some of the investments you've made in some of the least developed countries in Africa, for example. What is holding it up? Yeah,
so this is where Dr. Kim got me super excited with his talk at Davos, where the World Bank has announced its programs to devote tens of billions of dollars a year to climate mitigation and clean tech innovation around the world. And underlying that is a realization that if we don't get a jump on climate change, there'll be some big bills to pay in the future. That's where the real trillions of dollars will be needed. But the technology is here, it's upon us. We need the dollars for the implementation and to get past the political obstacles. Al mentioned, for example, in America, the cost of the coal generating industry has dropped precipitously. We could buy it out for about $100 billion. And by the way, coal generating causes about $200 to $300 billion a year of health damage. So there are some financial arguments that I think come together when entrepreneurs and philanthropists meet good equity loss capital. Private capital then sees a better risk return, and that's why I'm super optimistic that this will happen. It needs to happen.
Thank you, Jeff. What about the role of governments? Magdalena Andersson, you are Minister for Finance of Sweden. We said earlier your government has been at the very forefront of climate action. You've adopted a new climate law that would make the Swedish economy carbon neutral by 2045. The law is legally binding as well, I should say, on future governments, just in case. So that's a good sign, and they're quite ambitious. You also say that Sweden is ready to lead on climate change. A small country like Sweden ready to lead now that the US, it is being said, is no longer there to lead. China says it wants to lead on this, but nonetheless, countries like yours are saying they are all up for doing it. In a nutshell, tell us how you plan to get to these ambitious goals of making your economy completely carbon neutral. What does it mean? How do you get there?
Thank you. Thank you very much, and thanks for being part of this panel. I think Sweden, we do have quite a long experience with working with climate change and environmental policies. I mean, we do have one of the longest experiences in the world when it comes to putting a price on carbon. We introduced our carbon tax already 25 years ago, and it has been very successful. What we've seen during these 25 years is that we have reduced our emissions substantially. At the same time, we've had good economic growth and high employment. So, I mean, in Sweden, I think we are closer to what President Gore was saying. I mean, we see low investments, we see slow growth in many parts in the world, and at the same time, we see the climate change. So these are two problems. But if we combine them, I think in Sweden, this is really seen as an opportunity for more investments and for more growth and for new jobs.
And as you say, you went against conventional wisdom, your GDP went up, and you have been able to keep that carbon price at a significant level too since 1991. So putting a price on carbon, not just at 29 euros, for example, where you started and where many countries are, but at 125, which a lot of people say makes a significant difference. The higher the level of the carbon price is. I wonder to what extent that tool has been useful, if you can see other countries adopting it in such a way, or did you have a sort of an unfair advantage because of the level of awareness that there already is within civil society in your country, among corporations? I know the political parties all came on board as well on this climate law, 7 out of 8, if I'm not mistaken. What was the advantage that you had to begin with?
No, I really think it's the experience we had during all these years. I mean, it would be difficult in Sweden to find a politician or a business leader or a union leader that would say that environmental policies are a threat to jobs or to growth. I mean, of course, when I raise taxes, which I do on climate-related issues, of course, I mean, Swedes complain. We're human beings as well. But people know this is not a danger to jobs and growth.
But usually governments find it a bit politically risky to go with this idea of carbon taxing. Anytime you say taxes, you sort of...
Yeah, and that's a good thing with this new Climate Act is that we do have a very broad majority in Parliament that stand behind the Climate Act. And what we're actually doing in the new climate law, which I think is rather unique, is that we're using our experience with the fiscal policy framework that we had for 15 years, and I mean other countries also have fiscal policy frameworks, also with broad majority, strict rules, and also good surveillance that we're actually following the fiscal policy rules. And now we're taking that method of working and translating it into environmental policy and climate change area. So we do have this framework with long-term goals. It's very broad majority in Parliament, and also be an independent council surveying the process. And I think the combination of the long-term goal and the broad political majority will make the long-term stability necessary to really get new investments going in Sweden. This would make it more attractive for investors to invest in climate-friendly investments in Sweden.
And other countries in the region have also adopted this model. Magdalena Andersson, thank you. And as I turn now finally to Erik Solheim, before you became head of UNEP, you were Environment Minister for Norway. And without dragging you into any kind of intra-Nordic rivalries, I just wanted to mention that Norway as well was quite ambitious. It set a national target to become carbon neutral by 2030. Almost making Sweden look bad. By 2030, that's quite ambitious. In any case, you've been well versed at the national level and now at the global level in all of these intricacies of finance, development flows, and so on. I know that you've led work on a new roadmap for green finance. Could you tell us what it entails exactly and how you plan to generate more resources through this?
Because I was absolutely heartbroken when I heard all these nice words about Sweden. I mean, it broke my Norwegian heart, because we have done exactly the same as Sweden. Why don't you praise us? I mean, why don't you on the praise these very, very nasty Swedes? I mean, that's Sweden and Norway is one on all these issues. That's reality. Let me just set out yet another reason for optimism. Christiana on her business card on the flip side has the word global optimist. And there is every reason to be global optimist. Think of what happened last week. Tesla passed General Motors and Ford in stock exchange value. Why is that? Well, they're hardly producing cars. The number of cars they're producing is very limited. It's all about how investors anticipate the future. Investors believe that in the future, Tesla will do better than General Motors and Ford. Can there be any stronger argument for why investors are on these matters? And if you allow me, just one out, because we speak as if the developing nations are not doing more. They are doing a lot. They're doing much more than many developed nations. And they're doing it with their own resources, and of course they're not doing it for the United States of America, Europe. China is working for China, India for India, African nations for Africa. 1 month back I was in the southern Indian state of Andhra Pradesh. 50 million people, surging towards green in a speed we have never, ever done in Europe or the United States of America. They are now, this month, launching the biggest singular solar-driven power plant in the world. They're going green in the general economy. They're doing it for the people of Andhra Pradesh because solar is now cheaper than coal. And they can electrify the villages by solar. They can drive the economy. They have the ambition of getting the economy up to 15% growth based on going green. They may or may not achieve such an ambitious target, but it shows how the world is moving. And then answering your question.
No, as you say,
I'll go trick first.
The developing world, extremely important in the adaptation mitigation aspect of this. We don't have India with us for one, but it is doing all it can, except that it says it cannot very quickly move to renewable energy because it wants to tap into the cheaper traditional coal and so on, fossil fuel.
They're moving very fast towards the green. And of course, it's also South-South cooperation in the sense that the equipment where they go green is Chinese.
Changing, but could I
But you allow me to set out the...
Sure, but let me just ask the question, if I could. I'm just saying, in terms of what you are doing to help the developing world deal with this transition into renewable energy and a more resilient green energy economy, I wonder to what extent the developing world will be happy with seeing the current changes in the financial system that you have been calling for example, climate and development sectors ultimately having to converge, because in many respects they also feel that the climate financing aspect of this has to do with reparations.
Not only they are happy with it, they are driving it. It was China as the G20 presidency who really put green finance front and center in the international financial system.
But are they happy with the convergence?
They, with us, wanted to answer one question, and that is, what will it take to transform the inner core of capitalism, which of course is banks, financial institutions, insurance companies, and pension funds? What will it take for them to go green? Mm-hmm. How can the Bank of China, the Central Bank of China, regulate the market so that the Chinese investors go green? How can you regulate the stock exchanges so that this happens? Can you put disclosure claims for companies so that this happens? It was not that China was encouraged by someone else. China took the lead, frankly, with us in UN Environment for this to happen. And that was also the background for the product which we are launching today, Jim Kim, World Bank, and UN Environment. But it was inspired by China in that sense. This is a roadmap for sustainable financial system. What will it take for the big part of capitalism to go green? And if I may add just finally, we will later in the year launch a global platform for mutual learning, where one country can learn from each other. We will launch it in the UN Environment. We hope to have World Bank as a partner in this, maybe other parts of the UN system, so that everyone can learn from best practices in other parts of the world.
Thank you very much, Mr. Solheim. Mr. Gore, I know you wanted to...
Yeah, I just wanted to jump, and I think Jim was anxious to make maybe the same point. The situation has changed in India, and the situation, they're shifting dramatically in their forward-looking energy plans towards solar. Particularly solar, also wind, but particularly solar. Why? Well, there are two reasons. One is that the cost of electricity from solar continues to come down quite dramatically. And it's a heaven-sent set of developments. There are some areas of technology that yield to research and development and to scaling in their deployment. We've seen that with computer chips and Moore's Law. We've seen it with flat-screen TVs, mobile phones. And when the cost of the new renewable energy falls below the cost of fossil energy, then that's a non-trivial change. The difference between 0 degrees and 1 degree is a difference of more than 1 degree. It's a difference between ice and water. And in capital markets, the difference between more expensive than and cheaper than is similarly non-trivial. Capital is frozen when the market doesn't reward investments in more expensive alternatives. But when they become cheaper and more profitable, then liquid flows of capital rush in. That's happening all over the world. Now, the second reason that India is shifting is one of the same reasons why China shifted before India. The co-pollutants from burning fossil fuels are making the cities, especially in developing countries, virtually unlivable because people are choking on the pollution, and it's creating the potential for political instability. And so when you have a new technology that is simultaneously cheaper and cleaner, and once it's built, the next kilowatt hour has zero marginal cost, then you get this incredible surge of investment. And there's a third point. Right. Because think of I mentioned mobile phones, and some of you know this analogy, but it is exact and it holds. There was a famous study that AT&T here in the US asked around 1980 when the first big clunky mobile phones appeared, how many of these can we sell 20 years from now in the year 2000? And the study came back, and McKinsey's asked me to stop saying it was their study. They're a great organization. But they said, good news, 900,000. Right. Well, when the year 2000 arrived, they did sell 900,000 in the first 3 days of the year. And they sold 120 times what was projected. Now, why is that relevant? In the developing countries, there was not an existing landline telephone grid. So in addition to the other advantages of mobile phones, they were able to leapfrog past the terrible barrier of having to build out a landline telephone grid. What is the state of electricity grids in many of these developing countries? India has as many people with zero electricity as the entire population of the United States. And so the opportunity to leapfrog the old, dirty, expensive forms of electrification are now leading to this incredible explosion of investments and the build out of renewable energy.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Gore, for putting that in context and just adding
That's what I
on
was
to
going
it.
to say, too.
And I want to get to you. I have another question here for you, but working from this very point, Dr. Jim, I mean, coal, as you say, yes, people in India and other countries, developing countries with huge population needs may be shifting toward renewables, but coal does remain very cheap and often the go-to energy source. But let's not sort of argue on this point, but perhaps ask Dr. Jim, how do you then drive more investment in renewables in developing countries? What can the World Bank do to de-risk perhaps some of these investments?
Well, we're talking about what will it take to actually reach our mitigation goals. And so when the refugee crisis in Jordan and Lebanon came up, we started talking about concessional financing, below market rate financing should follow the refugees. And if the refugees happen to be in high middle income countries, they're the ones who are making the sacrifice and providing the service for the world, so we should provide them with concessional financing. And people at first thought, oh, that makes sense, but that actually was revolutionary because it meant that we were not going to do things based on sort of simplistic notions of gross national income per capita, and that was the determining factor. And so now the next step is to say, if you want to really mitigate, you need to follow the carbon. And it's not really a question of what the GNI per capita is. The question is, what level of concessional financing will it take to start these processes that we know will lead to dramatic drops in carbon footprint? Now, what I would add in India, though, and my friend Subhash Garga, who's the representative of the Indian government to the World Bank, is that leadership from Prime Minister Modi was also very important. He set a very ambitious target for solar, and then everyone started moving, including us. And so we were involved in some of the latest auctions, and we went over a year, Subhash, if I'm right, of over 10 cents a kilowatt hour down to 4.4, right? $2.90? 4.5 cents per kilowatt hour. So it went down in more than half. Now, when I first met Al, he was giving me all of these just what seemed to be like, fantastical projections of what would happen. And from my own memory, we've gone past all of them. Yep. All the projections he gave me that I thought were fantastical, we've gone past them. So there's something very special going on here. And I was converted in terms of the negative consequences. I couldn't believe that there was the positive side of it, but that's where it is. And so in Africa, for example, it turns out that that it's things like knowing how to do an auction. It's things like just having the right paperwork. Yeah. It's things like, you know, relatively small changes in the regulatory environment. And then we're getting in Zambia, which is about a year ago now, we got 4.5 cents a kilowatt hour. And then I went to a meeting of African heads of state, and I announced that, and you could see simultaneously every single one of them turned around and said, we want that. Yeah. And so the box set solution, scaling solar, where we just bring everything from forms to assurances that will provide financing to power providers who win auctions and just run the auction, we're getting that kind of price all over Africa. So it's happening, and that, you know, for Zambia, their price of electricity was about 25 cents a kilowatt hour. So to be able to get them this auction for 4.5 cents, when I met the leader, he just simply said, the only thing I can tell you is we want more, and we want a lot more, and we want it as soon as possible. Now, what Al's saying is so interesting, because we've always focused on building out grids. But where I think we're realizing is that solar and wind-based micro and mini grids, if they spread, and if we get the storage technology that Jeff's talking about, there's your grid, right? And so it's a totally different way of thinking about it. Now, you know, on the telephone issue, right? There was a debate inside the World Bank, and some of the old-timers will remember, where we thought about investing in telephone poles in India. Right? And so we made the right decision there, right? Well, but every time I see Jeff, the time to the new battery technology shrinks, right? And this has been like over 4 months. It's shrinking and shrinking.
And a lot has changed. The innovation obviously playing a huge role. I will come back to you for closing remarks.
Can I jump in? Because I think what we all need to do here is a huge mental effort here, right?
I was going to ask you in your final comments,
model.
Christiana, if I can ask you to look ahead, as you say, what needs to change?
Yeah, so I think one thing, yes, all of the operational issues, you know, that we have discussed are already in the process of changing. But I think it is our thinking that is keeping us back here, right? So I have 2 daughters who always tell me, oh, that is so 5 minutes ago. Well, you know, thinking that climate action is expensive and is a burden and is a responsibility is so 5 minutes ago. So I've been sitting here looking at the title of this session. Frankly, this session should not be called Unlocking Financing for Climate Action. This title should be Unlocking Financing for Economic Growth that, by the way, has climate benefits. And that is the mental change that we need to really engage in. Because as long as we think, like what we thought 10 years ago or 5 or 6, that this is a huge burden, that it is, you know, it is not going to bring us the benefits that we know today, that has completely changed. The exponential growth of technologies and the drop in prices has made this the best opportunity, and has actually, this is the story of growth of this century. Right. And we have to get our brains into that modality so that we can then see all the opportunities that are in front of us, but that we don't see because we walk around thinking that we still have to unlock financing for climate action. Right. No.
Less of a myopic vision, changing of mindsets, a lot of heavy lifting, it sounds to me, still to be done, and you'll be at the forefront of it. Thanks very much, Christiana Figueres. Moving along with final comments to you, Jeff Skoll. To what extent do all of us have a role to play when governments are too slow? And we know the policy leadership is there, or so we think, after Paris. Businesses are doing what they can, some of them starting to see the economic sense of investing in renewable. But what about the rest of us? Do we need more disruptors, civil society, to put more pressure on businesses and governments to demand some of the change that we need and the investments we want to see?
Yes, you know, some of the things that come to mind, I'll mention quickly, India, Chile, and the world. India, one of the hurdles of getting the Paris Agreement was getting India to agree. Al had a brainstorm of how to work with India and some U.S. companies to help get solar IP in the hands of the Indian engineers, who have then been able to work with the World Bank, and 100 gigawatts of India's projection of 175 4 new gigawatts of energy by 2022 is coming through this solar PV example. 2, 10 years ago, there was a projection, a study by probably McKinsey, but I don't want to say that, that said that in the year 2016, give or take, there would be commitments for about 16 gigawatts of new photovoltaic implementation around the world. Well, they were right. Chile alone made 16 gigawatts of commitments, and the world made about 350 gigawatts, China being a big part of it. Third, globally, we are on the cusp of this energy revolution that will speed up with the disruptors, civil society, businesses, the financial pressures, and all of you. We can speed up a global clean energy architecture from 2040, 2045 to 2025, 2030, and that will make a giant difference in not just climate, but in clean water, in agriculture, and in health, and in all kinds of things. We're on the cusp. Transportation, we're on the cusp of this giant revolution, and it's exciting that many of the people in this room, you have that chance to make that revolution happen.
A role for everyone to play, but still, thank you, Jeff. Looking at you, Magdalena Andersson, still a lot of people look to government to lead the way on this. I wonder to what extent do rich countries in the north, European countries perhaps, to what extent are they still committed to drive this along financially speaking? Because there is a target, it's 100 billion a year in climate finance by 2020. There are concerns that this may not be reached. What needs to happen, and how committed is Europe?
I think we should both lead by example by doing the right things back home in our own countries, but of course we should also lead by helping other countries, poor countries, to be able to make those investments. I also think we have to change the mind frame, because we're talking about finance for climate action, but really in all investments we do in all countries all over the world, we should think about the climate consequences of those investments. So it's not just unlocking some money that should go to climate-friendly investments. All investments must be climate-friendly. When we build a school, it must be energy effective, and you should have solar panels, no matter where in the world it's built. When we build houses, when we plan our cities, when we build our infrastructure, when we plan the meals in our schools or in the hospitals, we should think about the climate consequences. We really have to mainstream climate policies in all investments and all political decisions that we're doing. But we know that the most cost-effective way of getting investments in the right direction is to have, and research showed this, is to put the price on carbon. If you want to reduce emissions, well then put the price on those emissions. That's the most cost-effective way of doing it.
And as you mentioned, not just accelerating the speed at which we get and unlock these trillions, but making sure it goes in the right direction. Eric Solheim, does too much money still flow into high carbon investment, one, and is enough being done to enlist financial institutions, multilaterals, to take a key role on this?
It's absolutely not enough, but we see a huge shift. And the reason why we see this shift is largely due to price. And that's why China and India is so important. Not that they're smarter than the rest of us or more moral than the rest of us, just that the markets are so enormous. So when China changes, it brings down the price. It brings the price so much down that it's affordable for everyone else, for Latin America, for Africa, for everyone else. Let me just give you one example from India. Prime Minister Modi has spearheaded a campaign to make LED lamps available all over India. It's fantastic for the environment, fantastic for the economy of India, and fantastic for the customer because it's much cheaper than the previous. And it's cheaper for one reason, the size of the market, because it makes an enormous difference when you produce 200 million lamps when you compare to producing a few tens of thousands of lamps. The price has gone down to less than 1/10 than what it was before Prime Minister Modi launched this initiative. So that's the importance of China and India. They're linking it to economic development. They're linking it to reducing domestic pollution. When Beijing last week, or maybe it was the week before, closed down the last coal power plant in Beijing, it was of course fantastic for the pollution in Beijing and good for global climate at the same time. And if I may, just one last sentence. If you're looking for the ultimate proof that we're on the right path, was what happened in Kentucky the other day. You are aware of it. There is a coal museum in Kentucky celebrating the coal and the history, the great history of the coal miners. But they needed to decide for new energy. What did they pick? Solar. So now the coal museum in Kentucky is fueled by solar, because even in Kentucky, solar is cheaper than the alternatives and can compete with everything.
The perennial debate, but trying to now end this on a positive note if we can. Al Gore, you said that we are going to win this, ultimately. But it matters how fast we win, doesn't it? I mean, if we don't win this fast enough, we all lose, don't we? What do you think needs to happen next, and how important is it to highlight the nexus between climate change and the effects of climate change and national security for many countries with so many billions of dollars going into defense budgets at a time when we well know not only that we need more money in climate action and renewables, but there is a correlation if nothing is done.
Well, there definitely is. One brief note on the cost of solar. The latest low contract signed was for 2.4 cents per kilowatt hour. And the cost has come down for the best contracts 60% in the last 8 months. But anyways, to your question, yes, this transition, the sustainability revolution, the transition to renewable energy, energy storage, electric vehicles, sustainable agriculture, sustainable forestry, it is connected to the prospects for a healthy global economy, as I mentioned earlier. But you are exactly right, Ghida. It is connected to security issues. One day last year, a city in Iran had a heat index, the combination of temperature and humidity, of 74 degrees Celsius, 165 degrees Fahrenheit. Scientific groups, including the Max Planck Institute recently, have been projecting that significant areas of the Middle East and North Africa could become literally uninhabitable. What are the security implications of that development? Well, we saw something of what that could mean in the story of Syria. The Eastern Mediterranean has had the worst drought ever measured. The records only go back 900 years, but it's the worst ever measured. And it's climate related, as peer-reviewed studies have spelled out very clearly. It has to do with the change in the atmospheric patterns. And between 2006 and 2010 in Syria, a climate-related drought destroyed 60% of all the farms in Syria, killed 80% of all the livestock in Syria, drove 1.5 million climate refugees into the cities of Syria, where they collided with another 1.5 million refugees from the tragic Iraq war. And WikiLeaks released dialogues from within the Syrian government before the civil war with ministers saying, this is going to cause a social explosion. We can't handle this. It's beyond our capacity to deal with it. And of course, the gates of hell opened in Syria for multiple reasons, but the primary causal event was this destruction of agriculture and the flow of refugees. Look what happened next. The flow of refugees from the Middle East and North Africa into Europe has had a destabilizing consequence in Europe. And by the way, in the Brexit campaign in the United Kingdom, the single most powerful advertisement was a picture of refugees lined up at the border of the EU. And so the consequences for political stability are extremely serious. And there are many countries, as we all know, that have a real challenge at governance, even in the best of times, and these additional burdens can tip them over the edge. So, yes, it matters a great deal how quickly we win this. There has been regrettable damage already done. And we talk about these air temperatures. 93% of the heat energy being trapped goes into the oceans. and it comes back out again over time. The heat we're trapping every day is equivalent to what would be released by 400,000 Hiroshima-class atomic bombs exploding every 24 hours. It's a big planet, but that is a lot of energy, and it has consequences. And those consequences have not, even the ones already built into the climate system, have not all been felt yet. So the decades ahead of us will challenge the courage and character of humanity. We have to be brave, we have to be resolute, we have to have vision, we have to move forward, because we still do have the opportunity to avoid the worst and most catastrophic consequences. We still do have the opportunity to make this an opportunity, to make this an occasion for creating lots of jobs. It's the biggest business opportunity in the history of the world, the biggest investment opportunity. But we have to have a clear vision, and we have to have policy leadership, and we have to have the kind of leadership that Jim Kim is showing here at the World Bank to bring the world community together to get the financing that is needed to move the momentum more quickly. And I'll just close by saying, if anybody doubts we have the will to change, remember that the will to change is itself a renewable resource. Thank you.
On this very optimistic note, mindsets have to change, but you are hopeful, Al Gore. President Kim, now the challenge is yours, and the final word is yours too. You've talked about the need to act with the speed and the scale that these times require. In a nutshell then, what needs to happen next? Where should the onus be placed on governments, on businesses, on galvanizing civil society, consumers into action? You've also said that the World Bank, under your leadership at least, will amplify the voices of developing nations. How optimistic are you that you can deliver on all of these issues? And as host country of the World Bank, I wonder if you are confident that you can convince the president here, from president to president. Does it matter?
Well, look, I talk with my Italian colleagues in the G20 finance ministers meeting about what Antonio Gramsci used to say, which was in dealing with the most difficult problems and dealing with poverty, you have to have a pessimism of the intellect and an optimism of the will. So I'm always optimistic, but I have to tell you, I'm so much more optimistic after today, listening to this panel. Can we just give a big hand to this whole panel? Amazing. But I'd say this. I mean, the change that has happened since I first met Vice President Gore and to today, there are so many more positive forces moving in the right direction. I mean, back then, remember you told us to put a plan together, and we put these 5 items out there: price on carbon, removing fossil fuel subsidies, climate smart agriculture, smart cities, and one other thing that I can't remember. But we're all working in the direction of many of those issues, and what happened is just, it's extraordinary. And, I think India's leadership in moving so quickly on solar is an incredibly positive sign. And so here's what I would say. I'd say there's so many now, the incentives and the market forces are aligned so that certain things are going to move very quickly. Right, but if not on a negative note, but there are just profound justice issues involved here, and there's some very high-hanging fruit. Right, there is the Adaptation Agenda in some of the poorest countries in the world. The poor say that we have the boot of climate change on our necks every day, and it's great that you're moving so quickly on mitigation. But what about things like climate smart roads? What about things like climate smart agriculture moving quickly enough so we can feed ourselves? I think there's still things that the market's not completely aligned on. But I'd say that if we can just bring all the different forces, and Eric's great idea about a platform for bringing people together to share knowledge, I think the platform has to extend and include financing and include all the different tools that we have to bring about policy change. If we can bring all of that together, I think eventually the market forces will take off, and it could take off very soon. But I just would say, we cannot forget the social justice element of climate action. We've got to maintain our focus and make sure that it doesn't all go toward fancy new technology, but it goes toward, for example, making sure that every time it rains, people don't, lose their homes. And this is happening in so many places. So I come out of here so inspired by what I've heard, and by the end of this, by tonight, tomorrow, I hope that we can announce a platform that will bring these kinds of forces together to create the kind of planet that all of you deserve, and certainly our children and grandchildren deserve. Thank you.
Let me just briefly thank all of our panelists. A wonderful discussion, very enriching and inspiring, as you say. President Kim, Al Gore, Vice President Al Gore, Christiana Figueres, Jeff Skoll, Magdalena Andersson, Eric Solheim. Thank you all very much for the work you continue to do on this and for this enriching conversation. Thank you, and thank you all very much indeed for being with us and for joining this conversation.